Hello, friends. Greg Koukl here, Stand to Reason, and no callers this hour. I want to spend it devoted to conversation with one of my favorite people, Stephen C. Meyer. He's the author of Signature in the Cell, got his PhD from University of Cambridge in philosophy of science, founder and director for the Center for Science and Culture Discovery Institute. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, but he's just a great guy to have in your corner when it comes to the whole debate about science and religion, particularly as it relates to the issue of Darwinian evolution. Steve, it's great to talk with you again.
It's always good to talk with you, Greg. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We get to chat once, now and again, just by ourselves, and we have such great conversations on the phone as I'm taking long drives or whatever, or maybe we bang into each other at some event, and I'm always wishing that our audience could kind of be listening over our shoulders because it's so much fun. So we get to do that a little bit today. I have in front of me, this is totally unrelated to our conversation, but I have a set of notes that I discovered on my computer, Steve, that was from March 21st, 1994, when you were at Talbot giving a lecture. And I think this is one of the first time. Now, we had met actually before this, I think, because you came and did something at my church for me. But this was the first talk where you were talking really about the ID stuff. Demarcation and design was the name of the talk. And Melinda and I were in that classroom, and I mentioned this to her. I said, look at these notes. They were on my computer. I just typed in Meyer, trying to find what I had on you, and there these notes popped up. And it was amazing.
You're making me feel old.
Well, the thing that stands out for me about that particular talk, and I think I've mentioned this to you, but I'm going to mention it to the audience because it's a great point. You were talking about information, and you held up a sheet of paper, your notes or something, and you said, I could know everything about this sheet of paper physically speaking. I could know it exhaustively. I could know it omnisciently, all the things about the paper and the ink and the size and the weight and all of that, but I would never know what it says. And that was such a cogent way of conveying to me as your student at that time, as a young, brand new MA in philosophy student there at Talbot, about the role of information in the unseen world. And of course, your whole career has been built on this, at least your popular career, the one that most people know about, has been built on the whole issue of information and the Darwinian project.
Well, it really is the crucial issue in all these debates about biological origins, because we have come to realize that information essentially in a digital form, as it's stored on the DNA molecule, is running the show inside living cells. It's directing the construction of all the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. And it is kind of, in a way, ironic or just intriguing that at just the time in the history of human technology that we are developing information-based technologies, the ability to store and transmit information in digital form in a computer environment, we have discovered that the same kind of technology has long pre-existed us in every cell of every living organism. So it's a kind of the information age, which we use as a metaphor to describe our own technological environment, is now in some strange way applicable to life as well.
Yeah, well, and you have been leveraging that point successfully for 20 years. I guess it didn't. The change didn't fall into the meter for me. Until just recently, that you were not just a significant player at the Discovery Institute, the Center for Science and Culture, but you were actually one of the founding fathers of that enterprise.
Well, I had a chance when I was still a young professor at Whitworth in Spokane to develop a proposal for a program at the Discovery Institute with my colleague John West, who's the associate director of the program and a very fine scholar in his own right. And what we were recognized at the time was that there was really a tremendous collection of really talented young PhDs from great institutions, top places, who were collectively skeptical about the neo-Darwinian project and the whole materialistic evolutionary approach to understanding life's origins. And one by one, these members of this now group were getting to know each other and know about each other, and it kind of dawned on everyone that we weren't supposed to exist. And there were guys that had done PhDs at University of Chicago, and people who had done PhDs at Caltech and in Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard, and it was just kind of a shocking realization that to each person that we weren't alone in our doubts about Darwinian evolution. And so the idea at Discovery was that what if we raise some money and put some research dollars behind some of this talent, and what would happen? And books like The Design Inference by William Dembski and Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe and others started to come forward to define the intelligent design position, and it's just kind of continued from strength to strength type of basis since then. Since we started the program in 1996, we've had about 120 books written by the scientists and scholars associated with the Center for Science and Culture, and 12 or so documentary films, and there's been science education policies have been changed in 9 or 10 states as a result of efforts of the people who work with the center. So it's been a really it's been an amazing run, and it's been a great privilege to be affiliated with so many really talented people who are convinced that the materialist view of reality is almost certainly false, as one scholar put it recently.
To paraphrase the subtitle of an atheist scholar's recent book, Mind and Cosmos.
Yeah, I wondered why that phrase tumbled off the tongue, but yeah, the great story, actually. Thomas Nagel, who made the mistake of commending one of our books in 2009, and then he was kind of hammered by his atheist brethren, and that we thought he'd had enough, and then in 2012 he came out with his own book called Mind and Cosmos, subtitle, How the Neo-Darwinian Materialist View of Reality is Almost Certainly False.
Did you notice something else in the title, though? That is his last clause there, almost certainly false, is almost exact copy of the conclusion of Richard Dawkins' argument in The God Delusion, but he says that the idea that God exists is almost certainly false.
Oh, I didn't realize there was that parallel.
Yeah,
so he had an ironic twist to his.
Yes, I think there was a little poke in the eye there at Richard. I'm not sure.
Well,
but
that's well deserved, I'd have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, because Richard's been poking people in the eye for a long time.
Well, also his arguments are just so awful. They're really bad. He writes this whole book called The God Delusion, which is premised on the idea that the design argument has failed, and he thinks the design argument was the best argument for the existence of God because it was premised on publicly accessible evidence, and he may have a point there, but he said since Darwin we've known that there is no evidence of design, only the appearance of design, and the appearance of design we think is only an appearance because we think that natural selection and random mutation have the power to mimic a designing intelligence. But in making that argument, he doesn't deal with any of the really up-to-date arguments for design, including the argument from information in living cells.
Right.
So,
I thought for our conversation here, there's a couple of things that I want to accomplish.
Sure.
Two things generally that will probably range over a number of things. I do want to get an update from you in just a bit, in layman's terms, on the state of the ID debate versus the materialist Darwinian point of view. And this is something we always talk about, and this is significant part of your writing as you move along, and you have the signature in the cell, which is I consider your magnum opus. But you weren't resting on your laurels. You published since then. I've got Darwin's Doubt next to me, that advances more of these arguments. And then I want to talk a little bit about the debates that you're having with the theistic evolutionists. So there's a lot of things that are happening right now, and I want to bring people up to date. But I'm also aware that a lot of our listeners maybe don't have their feet firmly planted in an understanding of ID and how that approach works. And so maybe you've already laid out a little bit just talking about the history with the Discovery Institute. Can you talk a little bit more about the information and intelligent design and just how the model works? And one thing that I wanted to mention about all of the books that you said, over 100 that have been published, is I want people to understand that these are not books that are exegeting Scripture. That is not the approach at all that you're taking. These are scientific books that are inferring design from the scientific evidence. And so if you can cash that out a little bit in a foundational way, and then we'll start talking about what's been happening lately in both the secularist front and the religious Darwinist front of the theistic evolutionists.
Yeah, you bet. That's a great outline. Let's start with just maybe defining intelligent design. The theory of intelligent design asserts that there are certain features of life and of the universe that are best explained by reference to an intelligent cause, a mind, rather than an undirected material process, such as, for example, the Darwinian idea of natural selection acting on random mutations. Mm-hmm. And one of the best ways to understand intelligent design is to understand it in contrast to the idea that it was specifically formulated to challenge. The idea or term evolution can mean lots of different things. It can mean change over time. It can mean continuous change over time, as depicted by Darwin's branching tree of life, picture of the history of life, which is another way of thinking about his idea of universal common descent. Mm-hmm. And it can also mean the idea that there's an unguided, undirected material process, such as natural selection and random mutation, mm-hmm. that has the power to produce all the forms of life we see today, including the appearance of design that those forms of life manifest. So the third meaning of evolution is the idea that design is essentially an illusion. It was produced by an unguided, undirected process. So we have design without a designer, the appearance of design mm-hmm. produced by an unguided, undirected process. And that's the meaning of evolution, that intelligent design is challenging. Mm-hmm. And we think that there's lots of evidence of actual design, both in the cosmos and in living systems. And in living systems in biology, in the area that I work, it's really, the evidence for design is really exquisite. Mm. What we're finding inside cells, which were thought to be extremely simple entities back in the 19th century at the time when Darwin formulated his theory, is that cells are actually immensely complex. There's an integrated form of complexity everywhere evident in cells. We have miniature machines, nanotechnology. We have DNA molecules chock full of digital code that in fact provides instructions for directing the production of these complex machines made of proteins. And overall, you have something like an integrated chemical factory, all on a miniaturized scale.
When you mention that, I think of the incredible graphics in the one of the first DVDs that you guys were involved with. I think it's called Unlocking the Mystery of Life. Is that it?
Right. Unlocking the Mystery of Life has a lovely animation in it of what's called the gene expression system, which is essentially how the digital code in the DNA directs the construction of the protein and protein machines mm-hmm. that cells need to stay alive.
Yeah.
So inside living cells, you've got digital codes stored in DNA molecules. You have a complex information processing system. You have circuitry, networks of cells, or networks of genes, rather, that are forming integrated circuits that control the expression of other genes, and advanced forms of nanotechnology, little miniature machines, rotary engines, sliding clamps, robotic walking motor proteins that that drag vesicles of material along essentially a railroad track type.
It's a little city in operation.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
all of it,
and it's made more visual, obviously, in this Unlocking the Mystery of Life, which does also include some of what you talked about earlier. That is the history of the development of this movement, and we recommend it all the time because it really gives people a visual where visuals are needed. It's hard to, I think, understand this complexity that you're describing. Once you see it happening, you see like a small well, small because it's microscopic, but it's a complex metropolis that's operating in all those ways that you described. And these things reproduce themselves sometimes every 20 minutes,
at incredibly rapid rates. The information processing is just incredible. One other thing that would help for your listeners to visualize this is to go to my website, darwinsdoubt.com. The website for the current book also has a YouTube channel on it with interviews and debates, but also a playlist of animations. One of which is called Journey Inside the Cell, which I highly recommend to your listeners. They can go in 2.5 minutes and get a really clear visual depiction of what we're talking about as to how the information stored along the spine of the DNA molecule is used to direct the construction of these protein parts. One analogy that might help is what happens up here at the Boeing plant in Seattle. We're famous in Seattle for Microsoft, which writes code, and Boeing, which uses code to direct the construction of airplanes. It's a technology called CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and manufacture. And engineers will write code. So they'll sit at their console, write the code. It will be to say direct the construction of an airplane wing. The code will be translated into another machine language, which will then direct the construction of the airplane wing. It may direct a manufacturing arm to place the rivets in very specific places in accord with the engineer's instructions. And something very like that is taking place inside living cells, where digital code is directing the construction of mechanical parts. It's really exquisite.
Let me ask you just to clarify one other point, because as you mentioned defining evolution, there are a couple of different things, or more than that, on the table. Maybe one way of looking at it is there is a mechanism on the table, which is, let's say, mutation and natural selection. So this is a mechanistic process. But you identified something else that's really important. I think there's a little controversy even about this, but that evolution is an unguided, undirected process, as one person put it, that did not have us in mind.
Right.
Famously put it. But this I think is an important part. I know in some discussions, some people want to argue that evolution itself does not entail the idea that it is unguided, undirected process. But it just strikes me that the rank and file practitioner of science in these areas, and the people who are the main spokesmen, virtually always characterize it this way, and that if you say otherwise, like you say, okay, but there's a designer somehow operating this mechanism that you're describing, that's when they say, wait, you don't understand what evolution is if you're inferring a designer at any point, because an essential part of our program here is that it is unguided and undirected, and if you infer a designer anywhere in the process, then you're breaking that sine qua non of Darwinian evolution.
Well, right. This is really hard baked into the logic of Darwin's argument in The Origin of Species, and it's important to understand this. What Darwin was trying to do was explain the origin of the appearance of design. It was a big part of what he was up to. And you see this in the third chapter of The Origin in particular, where it tries to show that natural selection and random mutation, he would have at that time called it random variation. He didn't know about mutation.
Right.
But the natural selection mechanism explains the adaptation of organisms to their environment, which had previously been thought by 19th century biologists to be the best evidence of design, of intelligent design. Every organism is fish live in water, they've got gills and swim bladders, and They're well adapted to their environment.
Well, one would probably want to say designed would be the obvious way. They're not just, in a sense, accidentally adapted. They are made for or fit for that environment. Is what
right,
you're
right,
Okay.
And that was the 19th century. That was the one of the best arguments for design in the 19th century. And Darwin said, "Well, I can explain that." And I use an example in my book. It wasn't one that he used, but he used lots of examples like this. My example is of sheep in the far north of Scotland. And if you want to get a woollier breed of sheep, what do? Well, sheep herders have known for centuries that if you breed the woolliest males and the woolliest ewes and let them have offspring, then lo and behold, they're going to be offspring in that they're going to be a little bit woollier. And if you repeat that process generation after generation after generation, you can eventually breed a woollier breed of sheep.
Right.
And Darwin, in effect, said, well, nature can accomplish the same end. If, for example, we imagined a series of very cold winters such that only the woolliest males and females survive, then again, you'd get a woollier set of offspring
kind of a
with each
selective
generation.
breeding, right.
So what Darwin wanted to do was devise a mechanism that could produce a greater adaptation to the environment without involving an intelligent agent. So the mechanism of natural selection was devised to displace the role of intelligent design in producing adaptation. And so it's, in a sense, a designer substitute mechanism. Now, the question in 20th century biology is this. Are these minor adaptations, woollier sheep in cold climate or Galapagos finches with shorter or longer beaks in response to varying weather patterns, are the kinds of adaptations we see natural selection producing the only appearance of design? And if not, has natural selection and random mutation, the modern neo-Darwinian mechanism, explained away all those other appearances of design?
Right.
And that's where the positive argument for intelligent design comes in, because we want to say, first of all, no, natural selection and random mutation haven't explained away all the most striking evidences of design, in particular the miniature machines and the circuitry and the digital code inside cells. And secondly, there is a cause of which we know that can explain those kinds of effects, and that cause is intelligent agency. In fact, my argument centers on the importance of information, and what we know from experience is that whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, especially when we find it in a digital or alphabetic form, whether we're talking about information in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription on the Rosetta Stone, or information embedded in a radio signal, or information in a paragraph or book. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery that information lies at the foundation of living systems, that is actually running the show inside cells, is a powerful indicator of the prior activity of a designing intelligence, because we know of no other cause that produces that kind of effect. And that's one of the key arguments for design, for intelligent design.
Yeah, the discovery of information, to me, has the impact on the teleological or design argument similar to the discovery of the Big Bang and the cosmological argument, at least one.
Absolutely. In both cases, the new scientific discoveries revive these ancient arguments.
That's right. Okay, we got to go to break here. My guest, Stephen Meyer, author of Signature in the Cell and more recently Darwin's Doubt, and maybe he's working on something too he'll tell us about, but we're going to get back, having laid the foundation here, and finding out what it actually is, the new stuff that's going on, and how are our arguments faring right now in the field. Lots to talk about there here on Stand to Reason. Stay with us.
At Stand to Reason, we depend on the support of donors to carry on our mission to equip Christian ambassadors, and your non-cash donation items can help. You can transform your old cars, cell phones, or other items into ministry impact by donating them to Stand to Reason. Think of it. Because of your donation, Christians just like you will be able to effectively share their faith and change the lives of others forever. To make non-cash donations of all kinds to Stand to Reason, call iDonate at 877-897-4273 or go to idonate.com and visit STR's page. They'll take care of everything for you and Stand to Reason. Just call them at 877-897-4273 4273 or visit idonate.com. Thank you very much for making Stand to Reason's work possible.
All right, Greg Koukl here with you and my guest and friend and colleague, Dr. Stephen Meyer, signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt. Many of you know him from the Discovery Institute and his talks and debates and writings. Stephen, we've kind of laid a foundation now of the critical role of understanding information, especially kind of in a digital, how did you put it, alpha something or other?
Alphabetic or typographic
form is exactly what we have in the Cell. I appreciated also how you emphasize that the notion that the development of life is an unguided, undirected process is kind of hard-baked into Darwinism from Darwin himself, because this issue, we're going to revisit this a little bit later when we talk about theistic evolution. But there have been things that you've been involved with, obviously, all the time here in this ongoing debate. You're in the crosshairs of both the secular Darwinists and now the religious Darwinists, the theistic evolutionist crowd, the biologos crowd, etc. Let's talk a little bit about the secular Darwinists, because as we were talking a few months ago, you were talking about new developments that are happening and new engagements you're having and new information that is shedding more doubt on the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and also at the same time buttressing the arguments for intelligent design. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I could just update you on the reception of the arguments that I've made, in particular the argument of Darwin's Doubt. Darwin's Doubt concerns an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian Explosion, which is the event in which the major groups of organisms, or the major groups of animals, first arise in the fossil record. And I show in the book that to account for all that new animal form, you need, again, vast amounts of new information, and argue that that events like the Cambrian Explosion, in which there's a clear and evident infusion of a huge amount of new information into the biosphere, provide evidence for the activity of designing intelligence in the history of life. Again, because we know of no other cause for the origin of information apart from intelligent agency. Now, the book came out last year in June, and it was there were a number of reviews initially, and there were ones that were friendly and ones that were unfriendly. The critical reviews were by and large completely avoided the main argument of the book. They didn't address the question of the origin of information, so they were essentially nitpicking about little points of paleontology or things like that. There was, though, a review in Science, the largest science publication in the United States, in September, and it was a negative review, but it was respectful, and it was written by a very leading Cambridge paleontologist and evolutionary biologist named Charles Marshall, who is at University of California, Berkeley. And he said a few nice things about the book, but he had an overall negative verdict. But what was really encouraging to me was he attempted to take on the information argument. And he said, look, Meyer claims that you need a lot of new information, genetic information, to build these Cambrian animals. He said, but that's not our current understanding. Our current understanding is that all that would have had to take place is for the evolutionary process. The evolutionary process would have just needed to rewire the genetic regulatory networks that control the expression of pre-existing genes. Now, it was very elegantly stated the way he put it, but as I read that carefully and then broke it down, I thought, this is really a quite extraordinarily revealing response, because rewiring a genetic regulatory network is a network of genes that are functioning in something like an integrated circuit. But each one of the genes in the network is a gene full of genetic information. And so he's presupposing the existence of all that information in the genetic regulatory network.
To begin with.
Then he says it would need to be rewired by the evolutionary process, but rewiring a system of genes requires multiple coordinated changes in the digital code in each of the genes, and that's an additional input of information. Again, presupposed but not explained. And then thirdly, those genetic regulatory networks act on pre-existing genes for building the parts of various, say, Cambrian animals, and that's a third source of genetic information which he presupposed but did not explain.
Wait, explain that third step one more time to me. I missed it.
Well,
I heard it, but I wasn't
genetic regulatory networks control how other genes are expressed during the process of animal development.
Okay.
And so to get a full picture of how an animal develops, you need the regulatory networks, you need other genes for building essentially the parts list.
Mm-hmm.
And then Marshall was arguing you'd need to get a new developmental gene regulatory network so you could develop a new animal. You'd need to rewire these developmental gene regulatory networks. So you've got changes in code in pre-existing genes operating on other genes.
Let me put it this way and tell me if I got it. You need new machines and you need new management.
Something like that, or just the simplest way to think of it is that in order to explain information, the origin of information, you have to presuppose other information.
Yes, that's the problem
and
here.
So he's just, in other words, you don't need a PhD in biology to see what's wrong with this attempt to answer the argument.
Right.
It's basically begging the question.
Right.
Basic logical, informal fallacy in logic. And what was really encouraging to me was, first of all, that he had taken the time to review the book, that it was respectful, that it was written in science, but that he had tried to take on the argument, and in so doing had revealed just how weak the case actually is. And then Marshall and I had an hour-and-a-half debate on British radio where we discussed these same issues at greater length, and it was really a terrific conversation. And I think he's really grappling with the issues in a way that some of the other reviewers and many of the other people in the Darwinian establishment aren't.
So what was the basic in this debate with him? And I can imagine how refreshing it must have been to dialogue with a colleague who was up to the task scientifically and philosophically, and who stayed on topic, so to speak, and did not follow rabbit trails. What was the upshot of that in the public's mind, or was he himself saying, you got some good points here, and we're not sure exactly how to deal with this, or how did that play out?
It was a really interesting conversation, and it's actually available on my website, so people can go and listen to it for themselves. Mm-hmm. And I made the point that I just made to you in kind of my opening salvo, and Marshall. At one point, it was describing he was claiming that there are self-organizational processes that can help explain the origin of biological form. But I had watched a lecture that he had done at Harvard in which he had described these self-organizational processes. But in his own lecture, he made very clear that they only ensue after, or they ensue as the result of lots and lots of other pre-existing genes. So once you've got a lot of genetic information in place, then there are patterns of development that are kind of recurrent that suggest that there's a pre-programming that causes the subsequent organization.
Right. So
and I pointed that out to him, and he said that was a fair comment.
Wow. So it's like you're saying, there's a machine. How did that machine get made? Well, that machine was made by another machine.
Yeah, you don't need a baker to explain the origin of the bread. You've got a bread-making machine.
Yeah,
but the bread-making machine was made by a bread-making machine engineer,
Yes, right, exactly.
So you end up with this type of problem in trying to explain. Information is so foundational to life. I mean, I used to ask my students, you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would say, well, code, information, software. The same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you have to have new information. Mm-hmm. And that has turned out to be the very difficult thing for the mutation natural selection mechanism to account for, and that's essentially the problem.
Well, the reason I think that this is so exciting is because you write a book that raises an issue, and it's a legitimate issue, and the other side pushes back with a bunch of nonsense. But one person wants to try to play fair and does a write-up in Science, but then in his write-up, it essentially affirms your view by trying to explain it away by presuming the need for information to begin with. So
and
if that's
clear,
the best he can do.
He didn't mean to affirm my view, but
no.
my perspective on what he said is that he inadvertently revealed the weakness of the Darwinian position, its inability to explain the origin of information, apart from this illicit move of presupposing it,
Mm-hmm.
which is another way of confirming that there is no adequate cause for the origin of information apart from intelligence
Mm-hmm.
or apart from mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if people would like to learn more about this, that I've just come out with a paperback version of Darwin's Doubt, and the publisher very kindly allowed me to write an additional chapter, an epilogue, in which I got to respond to the main scientific critics of the book. And there were three main criticisms, and the most important one was Marshall's critique, and my response to him is written up there, and people can have a look and really weigh the arguments on both sides for themselves.
Well, you mentioned something in Darwin's Doubt about the Altenberg 16, and I actually read a piece today by Massimo Piglucci, who's one of the 16, and I wonder if you could mention something about what that is, and I have some questions I want to ask you about
Well, right. I mean, one of the themes of the book is that there is a huge disparity between the public presentation of Darwinian theory in textbooks and by people like Richard Dawkins and Eugenie Scott with her National Center for Science Education up in Oakland, the New York Times science writers. The public spokesman for Darwinism presented as a theory about which there is no controversy.
Yeah.
And there's a huge disparity between that presentation of the theory and the presentation of the theory as you find it in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, including the literature in the field of evolutionary biology. Charles Marshall himself, who I regard as one of the really top Cambrian paleontologists in the world, has been openly skeptical about neo-Darwinism since the late 80s.
Huh.
And he's trying to come up with other evolutionary models to account for the key problematic elements. But the main problem that many evolutionary theorists have acknowledged is that the mechanism of mutation and natural selection has very limited creative power. One evolutionary biologist says that mutation and selection explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It explains the small-scale variations, changes in the frequency of dark versus light-colored moths in the famed peppered moths in England, the changes in the Galapagos finch beaks, the adaptation of bacteria to antibiotics, etc. But it doesn't explain where we get moths or sheep or finches or animals, indeed, animals in the first place.
Yeah, that's a significant admission because this particular point has been made by people like you for a long time.
Well, in a way,
if natural
I
selection,
started making it because I was reading it in the literature, from the evolutionary biologists themselves. So there's a big disparity between what the popularizers are saying, what the textbook writers are saying, and what the leading people in the field are saying. And as a result of that, many evolutionary theorists are now trying to formulate new models, new theories, come up with new mechanisms, and some are even openly calling for a new theory of evolution. Members of the Altenberg 16 group are among those folks. This is a group of evolutionary biologists who met in the European city of Altenberg, and I think it was 2010, sometime around there, and they were exploring new approaches to evolutionary theory because they recognized the problems with the standard neo-Darwinian model. And in Darwin's Doubt, I have a couple of chapters where I describe each of these new models or new theories of evolution that have been proposed, and there's about 6 of them. And there's a couple reasons I wanted to talk about these. One, the very fact of these models shows that not all is well in the house of Darwinian theory. And secondly, I evaluated each one of them very carefully to show that they, too, fail to explain the origin of genetic information. One of the models, or new theories of evolution, is one that I think has a lot of merit to it. It's something called natural genetic engineering. And it's advanced by a brilliant cell biologist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro. And Shapiro shows that the mutations that occur in living organisms are not generally random, as the Darwinians say, but in fact are usually goal-directed by a kind of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. Essentially, the cell or the organism has the capacity to respond to various kinds of environmental stresses, and then it will generate mutations in a kind of directed way to try to solve certain problems. Well, that's really a cool new insight into how life works and how it's able to respond to environmental changes, but it begs a really important question. Where does all that pre-programming come from?
Right.
So there is evolution taking place in response to environmental changes, but it's within the context of pre-programmed adaptive capacity, which I would argue is additional evidence of design, and you would see in that pre-programmed capacity is the locus of design in the organism.
Let me ask you a question. Is he just explaining a way this could take place, but it entails another element of design? Or is he identifying things that are actually happening that can be properly called evolution, though it's not mutation, natural selection in the standard sense? It's this new mechanism which itself requires some design element.
It's more the latter. He's describing these processes that I think can be rightly called as evolutionary, in that they do cause organisms to change over time. But they are occurring because of pre-programmed adaptive capacity in the genome. He says that a lot of this is under algorithmic control. Well, algorithms are things we know from our experience are produced by intelligent agents. And so I think it's kind of, it's pre-programmed adaptive capacity that allows organisms to adapt and change and evolve in that sense.
In some measure.
So there's a sense in which there's evolution going on, but it's designed.
Evolution,
The ability to do so is designed.
Right. The machine that makes the machine is a design machine. We're kind of back to that again. So would this be an example of microevolution, that there is evolutionary capability within the limits that is designed into the creature, but it is within limits? Or...
Yeah, I think that's right. It's within the limits of the pre-existing genome and the algorithmic control of that genome, which we may not entirely understand at this place as to where exactly that's located. But anyway, it's a great new development in theoretical and evolutionary biology, but it doesn't really solve the fundamental problem of the origin of information. And that's so in highlighting these new theories, I wanted to give these guys due because there's some really interesting developments in the field. B, I wanted to show that neo-Darwinism is really long past its pull date. And C, I wanted to show that the argument for design still holds, that even these theories that have merit are presupposing rather than explaining the information that's needed to make these fantastically intricate processes happen.
Yeah, when I come back, I want to talk a little bit more about a pushback from their side regarding the Altenberg 60 and see what you have to say about it. And then I want to ask you about some of your discussions with the theistic evolutionists.
You bet.
Okay, I'm talking with Stephen Meyer, author of Darwin's Doubt. It's just being released now as a paperback, and it's been updated. You'll want to take a look at that. We'll have that posted on Twitter and also on our website blog tomorrow. I'm Greg Koukl. This is Stand to Reason. Stay with us for our final segment.
Each of us as Christian ambassadors faces two daunting challenges when trying to make a difference for Christ. First, how do we initiate conversations about spiritual things in a way that doesn't seem awkward? Second, how do we keep ourselves from getting trapped or overwhelmed by others more aggressive than we are? Well, that's what Greg Koukl can teach you in his book and DVD curriculum on tactics. Greg will teach you how to maneuver in conversations so you can create more productive dialogue with skeptics and challengers. Tactics are practical skills that Greg gives names like Columbo, suicide, steamroller, Rhodes Scholar, and more. Tactics are a way of engaging others effectively and winsomely, no matter what the subject. If you're tired of finding yourself flat-footed and intimidated in conversations about what you believe, if you want to increase your confidence and your skill in discussions, no matter who you're talking to, then Tactics is for you. Order Tactics in book, DVD, CD, or MP3 format at STR's online store at str.org. Or simply give us a call at 800-2-REASON. That's Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions.
Final segment here on Stand to Reason. Greg Koukl with Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute, Darwin's Doubt, Signature in the Cell, etc. Stephen, you did a fabulous job on the True You stuff that Focus on the Family put out. I just want to mention that because we provide that here at Stand to Reason. A number of segments, 5 or 6, 7 segments per class, so to speak. True You 1 and True You 2. You did one on the existence of God.
There are 10 short 25-minute lectures in each series.
Yeah, I think you're exceptionally capable of communicating complex ideas in a way that's accessible. You do a great job in those classes, so I want to recommend that material to folks. Steve does a little bit of kind of a mini classroom session, but talks about great arguments for the existence of God and the authority of Scripture. Really fascinating stuff. So, Altenberg 16, I read a piece, actually it's probably a couple years ago now, by Massimo, I hope I don't butcher his name.
Massimo Pigliucci.
There you go. Thank you so much for rescuing me there. Here is what his pushback on the way that I think you and some other ID folks have used the Altenberg 16 is he's trying to downplay the controversy that there is a fundamental scientific disagreement about evolutionary theory. But what he wants to do is say, look, well, there was Darwin, and then you have neo-Darwinism, so you got a little adjustment where mutations brought in with natural selection, and now that was like Darwin 2.0, and now we got Darwin 3.0. We're just making adjustments, but we still believe in evolution. Now, it strikes me that this is like keeping the sound of the word, but kind of retooling something so much that it's something very different. I might be mistaken on this, but it
really isn't a refutation of anything that I've written or the argument from design that I'm advancing, because remember, evolution can mean many things. It can mean change over time. It can mean universal common descent. The universal common ancestry thesis, and it can mean that the mechanism of mutation and natural selection have the capacity to produce all the form and the appearance of design that we see. What all the proponents of these new theories of evolution would affirm the first two meanings, and they're looking for some additional mechanisms that have more creative power than mutation and selection to supplement or to compensate for the gap in explanatory power in neo-Darwinian theory, which does rely on mutation and selection exclusively. And so, I'd encourage your listeners who are interested in this to dig into the chapters I do on this in Darwin's Doubt, because I actually show that each of the different theories will affirm different elements of the mutation selection mechanism and then try to supplement it with something else. And all that's fair and well and good. The point that I make, though, in the book is that none of these new theories provides a mechanism that accounts for the origin of information.
Which is that's the key thing. But it is fair, I think, if what they're doing is trying to round out the picture here, it is because mutation and natural selection, which is neo-Darwinism, is not adequate.
It's not adequate, and they are acknowledging that. And that's, and some will say, well, this is the extended synthesis. And others will say, well, we're coming up with a new theory of evolution. And it's really a semantic difference. In both cases, they're trying to add something to the theory to compensate for the inefficacy, the lack of creative power associated with natural selection and random mutation.
So what turns out to be the same is kind of the underlying materialistic commitment, but the picture of the thing itself is changing significantly.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's the typical rhetorical move. You criticize Darwinian evolution, you point out that other people have criticized it who are working within the field, and they say, well, that's not fair because we still accept evolution, by which they really mean we're committed
to a materialistic,
under all circumstances, to accepting some kind of materialistic evolutionary account of how things came about, even if we can't any longer rely on natural selection and random mutation. But that's really more a statement of their underlying philosophical commitments than it is an affirmation of any adequate theory or mechanism of evolutionary change.
Right. We got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to touch on something you mentioned to me in one of our recent phone conversations, and that was that a lot of the work you're doing now is debating theistic evolutionists, people who are basically advancing the whole neo-Darwinian synthesis as something God used. And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about that. I did have a big debate with a theistic evolutionist who helped form the BioLogos program with Francis Collins. His name is Carl Giberson. And partly because of what we were just talking about, how you have secular evolutionary biologists recognizing that neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory is inadequate, that the mutation selection mechanism lacks creative power. It seems to me a very odd time to have such a huge push in the religious world to, in effect, baptize the Darwinian way of thinking and say this is the way that God created the world. If the mutation natural selection mechanism lacks creative power, then saying that God used that mechanism makes absolutely no sense at all.
Right.
And secondly, I think there's just some really problematic theological and conceptual problems associated with the theistic evolutionary program. We've been calling on the theistic evolutionists to clarify what they mean by evolution. Do they mean simply change over time? Do they mean common ancestry? Or do they mean the idea that natural selection and random mutation, the unguided process of mutation and selection, is sufficient to produce all forms of life? By evolution, do they mean a guided or an unguided process? And almost all the current theistic evolutionists have been famously vague about exactly what they mean there. They've been really reluctant to clarify. And I think there's a reason for that, because there's a kind of dilemma that confronts their position. If they mean that evolutionary, or if they mean the mechanism of evolution is a guided process, something that God is actively guiding, well, that's a form of intelligent design.
Right.
But all the theistic evolutionists who are prominent in the debate have been very explicit in rejecting the theory of intelligent design.
Right.
So they have been, so that option is kind of off the table for them. But at the same time, they don't want to say that it's undirected, because any theologian worth his salt will realize that if the mechanism is really unguided, then it's not really clear what God is doing in creation, in which case they're affirming a position that is indistinguishable from deism.
Right.
And in my debate with Guyberson, he actually admitted that was a weakness of his position. So you either have a logical problem of God guiding an unguided process, which is nonsensical, or you have a theological problem in which you are affirming that really nature is doing this all on its own, and God is doing little more than just existing, which is kind of a form of deism.
It's a substandard view of God.
Yeah,
exactly. At that particular point. Well, I think it's telling. I listened, and I mentioned this to you when I was in ETS in the fall, that I sat in on a session with Dennis Lamoureux, who is an ardent advancer of not only of evolution, or the theistic evolution, but the idea that there was no Adam. I mean, he's taking it all that far, and there are all other problems with this. But one thing that stood out, though, is that he is concerned, and I know that Francis Collins has expressed this, that unless you accept the Darwinian model, then Christianity will not seem credible to outsiders.
I know this is exact. Their argument is not based on substance. They don't give arguments for the creative power of natural selection and random mutation. In fact, in my debate with Carl Guyberson, I made 4 separate scientific arguments against the creative power of mutation selection, arguments that reflect things that are going on in the peer-reviewed literature in evolutionary biology. And he made no attempt to rebut those arguments. Rather, the way the theistic evolutionists typically argue is essentially a consequentialist argument that says, if we don't accept Darwinian evolution, we're going to bring disrepute to the faith. We're going to show that it lacks intellectual credibility. But I think that's incredibly ironic, because we're at just that point in the development of evolutionary biology as a discipline where many leading theorists are acknowledging that neo-Darwinism is dead. Now, the theistic evolutionists I know aren't saying, it's dead, but we're supplementing it with these new theories of evolution. They're not saying that. They're just endorsing the standard theory and saying Christians need to accept it. And I think that's a very odd move to make at just the point that secular evolutionary biologists are rejecting the neo-Darwinian synthesis in droves.
I agree, but I think it's worse than that, because the only kind of evolution that is going to be acceptable to the other side is an evolution that is unguided and undirected.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what really, in the end, all the theistic evolution comes down to is a kind of generalized affirmation that somehow God is working through some kind of natural causes or secondary causes, without really specifying what those causes or mechanisms are.
Yeah, never mind the damage this is doing theologically with regards to the fall and the Adam question and original innocence, which Lamoureux told me when I asked him about it. He said, it doesn't matter whether there's any time of original innocence. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Oh, my goodness. Christian theology hangs upon that.
Well, the theistic evolutionists typically will say we didn't fall into sin, we fell up into consciousness. And I'll leave it to you to explain the theological problems associated with taking that position. But it's bad science. It's incoherent, I think, as a proposal because they haven't been able to specify exactly what God is doing in the, if anything, in the process of creation, and it raises all kinds of theological problems because one by one it eats away at the various Christian doctrines.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece last year, I think, called Drifting Towards Darwin, identifying some of these problems. People can find that at str.org, but this was my concern. We're losing the foundation when we drift towards Darwin because the only kind of Darwinism that the other side is going to accept from us is one that eviscerates our worldview, and that's not going to help anything. So, Stephen, we're all out of time. It has been fabulous talking with you as usual. Thanks for spending an hour with us, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Well, we packed a lot in an hour. It was a great conversation. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Keep up the good work there.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks. Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell. Those are starters. You can catch True You, the first two sessions with Stephen Meyer, and we have that at Stand to Reason and all kinds of other good things. Check out darwinsdoubt.com for lots of clips and writings, and he's got a lot of good things you can follow up on. Thanks for spending the time with me here at Stand to Reason, and I'm Greg Koukl, and I've just had a pleasure talking with you today. Go out and give them heaven this week, friends. Bye-bye now.